just want to thank everyone for coming. I just wanted to start by saying that my intention for doing this today is stimulated in part by the events that have been happening in Japan since March 11th of last year. The nuclear accident following the earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima, damage to multiple nuclear reactors over there, and what now appears to be not only a very significant but ongoing release of fission materials, reactor materials that are being released from these damaged reactors, and yeah, I get a lot of questions about this from my clients, and it's really remarkable the kind of paucity, the lack of information in the media, but even otherwise intelligent people saying very stupid things about this. So I'm going to try and not give an opinionated presentation today, just to and there's some noise in the background there, Lee, so I don't know. Okay, and I'm going to leave plenty of room for questions at the end. I'm going to not really get extremely technical with this. I think that tends to just put people to sleep. And go to the next slide. But I will entertain more technical questions if that's really something people want to know at the end. But I think I've given you enough, but not too much here. So the problem isn't just Fukushima, and so part of what I wanted to talk about today is, it's the radioactive accident du jour is Fukushima, but the problem of radioactive isotopes in the environment has been around a long time. It's going to be around a long time, and so in one way, it's really no different than all of the other toxic pollution that we deal with in integrative medicine every day. I mean, detoxification, dealing with toxicity, being mindful of toxicity, managing toxicity, working with toxicity as part of the treatment of disease, managing toxicity as part of a way of encouraging health. These are things that in integrative medicine we're doing every day. And so on the one hand, what you need to do and what you can do, you can't eliminate these things, so you're managing them. What we need to do is, on the one hand, no different than what we're all doing every day. And so it doesn't need a lot of fear. It doesn't need a lot of additional concern. There are no special tools other than what we already have. The one thing that may be different is that being more diligent about these might become necessary. That if you're a little lax about how you manage toxicity on a daily basis, this is a time to kind of up your game a little bit. But just starting with above-ground nuclear testing, bombs that were dropped on Japan, ongoing contamination from the weapons processing and nuclear fuel processing facilities in the country, ongoing environmental contamination either from seemingly healthy nuclear plants and environmental contamination from nuclear plant accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima being most well known. It turns out there have been others in Russia when it was the Soviet Union that were never really, not much was told about these. But there are some areas in the north-central part of Russia where dozens of square miles, hundreds of square miles are essentially uninhabitable because of some kind of nuclear contamination. Next slide. And the true amount of environmental contamination, it's unknown. Monitoring is poor. There's some attempts to look at anecdotal evidence in the same way that you can look at other heavy metals, like what were the total body burdens of lead and mercury 100 years ago. You can look at levels of some of these long-lived isotopes, things like cesium and plutonium, and then compare that with median levels that you can measure in total body counters in the average population today. There are some things that are kind of indirect evidence, not contamination of biological tissues, but the companies that build radiation monitoring equipment cannot find materials to build those instruments that are uncontaminated. Everything contains isotopes, and so you don't want the very instruments you're using to measure isotopes to themselves be radioactive. And so that final point on this slide, there was a famous battle in the First World War. It was the first time that steel battleships collided with each other, and it was a terrible loss of life and ships. But the German ships that sank off Jutland, the Battle of Jutland in World War I, still sit at the bottom of the sea, and it's some of the only steel left on Earth that isn't contaminated with radioactive isotopes, so they just leave it there, and when they need more steel that's not contaminated with isotopes, they just pull one of those ships up and melt it down and make instruments out of that. Next slide. Now, just a little on radiation physics here. Radiation physics, radiation biology, we need to talk about a little bit. And this is part of... This is one of the things that makes a radiologist just go nuts. People are constantly comparing apples and oranges when they try to talk about the risks and the radiation exposure from radioactive isotopes. So in biological systems, it's not how much radiation we encounter, but how much actually interacts with tissues. So, you're often told, oh, don't worry, the amount of radiation you were exposed to from that radionucleide test, or from that leak at the nearby nuclear power plant, it's trivial compared with what you're exposed to. It's just the same amount in a normal chest X-ray, or how much cosmic radiation you'd be exposed to on a cross-country plane flight. And next slide. But it's apples to oranges comparison in that there are two completely different concepts. The amount of radiation that actually passes by you, that would be a measure of physics. That's how much energy you were exposed to. But if that energy, if that gamma radiation, if those X-rays, if that cosmic radiation, if those pass by you, pass through you, and they don't ever interact with any of your tissue, then there's no biological consequence. So, yes, on the surface, if you put a dosimeter or a radiation counter at the surface of your skin, you may be exposed to a lot of radiation, but if it's high energy and it goes through you, then without ever interacting with tissues, there's no absorption of the energy, then there's no biological consequence. But also, when they tell you, oh, that CAT scan you just had, that's the same amount of energy you'd be exposed to on a cross-country flight. Well, to get an image from a diagnostic X-ray, you need to tailor the energy and the wavelengths of what's coming out of that X-ray tube so that it is absorbed by tissue. And so there are filters to filter the energy, to shape it, to smooth it, so that you get quite a bit of absorption in a diagnostic X-ray. Some mammograms, you may absorb 50% of all the radiation that you're exposed to, whereas on a cross-country flight, you may be exposed to as much energy. It may hit your skin from cosmic radiation, but go to the next slide. Cosmic radiation is such high energy that it often passes through you, through the plane, through the Earth, and out the other side and on back into space without ever reacting with any of the matter in its path. So there's no absorbed radiation, no absorbed dose, and therefore no biological consequence. And this is a really important understanding, that people, it's often as though it's an attempt to confuse. And go to the next slide. The units, and I've just refer you here to Wikipedia. Wikipedia actually has some pretty decent information about the different isotopes. It has good information about the different units used to discuss radiation. And if you really want a more detailed discussion, start there. It's a good place to start. Most of the textbooks of nuclear medicine that are used in training radiologists only include information on the isotopes that are used medically, and not a lot of the ones that are from fission reactions, like from bombs or nuclear power plants. And there are Helen Caldicott, who is a kind of crazy pediatrician. She was head of Physicians for Social Responsibility for a while. She's published some different books that have information more about radioactive isotopes from nuclear power. Find her books on Amazon. But just Wikipedia is a good, that's all that most people need. But the units, you have the units that the physicists use for measuring radiation. And they just talk about energy that's deposited in tissue. So the coulombs is a measure of energy, coulombs per kilogram. But that doesn't take into account the amount of damage done to living tissues, and so it's really of no use to us in this conversation. So the radiation deposited in tissues is called the absorbed dose, and the traditional unit is the RAD, the radiation absorbed dose, RAD. And the standard international unit is now the gray, so 100 rads equals 1 gray. Next slide. And this next point is pretty important, that not all radiation does equivalent damage to tissue. And this is, these are elaborate computer models that try and figure this out, where they have these dummies they've built at Oak Ridge in Tennessee that they expose to radiation of different sorts, and they put sensors all through the dummy to kind of get a sense of how radiation gets scattered in the human body, and if you expose the pelvis, what's the dose in the thyroid. But if you just keep it simple, 1 gray, 1 unit of alpha radiation, causes 20 times as much damage as 1 gray, 1 unit of X-rays. And so to allow a meaningful discussion, there was another unit that's used, and it's called the equivalent dose, and that's the sievert. And the sievert is the standard international unit of equivalent dose. And so if you talk in sieverts, it doesn't matter whether the energy is coming from X-rays or from gamma rays or from particle radiation like alpha and beta. There's a quality factor. So you take the physical measure, the coulombs per kilogram that the physicists would use, and there's a quality factor that's been determined, and you sort of correct the number of what hits the skin with the quality factor, and you end up with a sense of how much biological damage this radiation is going to cause. And so when you're talking about biological effects of radiation, the sievert is probably the most useful, because it kind of reduces everything to a single unit that's comparison. And just as an example, 50 sieverts is the maximum dose allowed per year for radiation workers. And there are parts of Fukushima, not right around the reactor, but the parts that were abandoned, many, many square miles of Fukushima Prefecture in Japan, where the exposure is over 5 sieverts per hour. So just to give you some sense that you couldn't even spend a full day in large parts of that part of Japan right now. And there are rather frighteningly high amounts of radiation that have been measured in Japan and the West Coast. We're going to get to that. Next slide. Just a little about some of the terms you hear about the types of radioactive decay. So radioactive isotopes are unstable versions of the element. So they have excessive numbers of protons, neutrons, usually, and they're trying to move towards something more stable. So they will shed protons and neutrons in different configurations as particle radiation. That would be alpha and beta. You can have other more exotic things. You can have an electron that gets captured by the nucleus of the atom, and it interacts, the negatively charged electron interacts with the positrons, and it negates it, and you change the element a little bit to a different form, and energy is released, and so that's where that energetic decay comes from. But just the alpha and beta are the ones we're most worried about here. So we saw how before in that previous slide how 1 unit, 1 gray of alpha radiation causes 20 times as much damage as 1 gray of X-rays. How can this be? Next slide. Well, if we ingest a radioactive particle that's an alpha emitter, say for instance plutonium-238, which has a horribly long half-life, thousands of years. Half-life, again, I think most people understand that, but how long does it take for half of the decay to occur? And so it's a logarithmic decay. But plutonium-238, part of its decay is as alpha particles. But those alpha particles, which contain 2 protons and 2 neutrons, they're very, very massive. They barely have energy enough to penetrate a piece of paper. But if that plutonium-238 lodges in your body, all of the alpha particles emitted, as the particle decays, they travel a short distance, and all of their energy is eventually deposited in surrounding tissues. And so the number of decays, the number of alpha particles may be small, but if 100% of their energy is absorbed, then there's a much greater amount of biological damage than, say, from the gamma radiation, which is the other portion of decay of plutonium-238. Some of that's very high energy, and a lot of that exits the body and without ever interacting with tissue. So it's these particles that really cause a lot of damage. Beta particles are more energetic, but still pretty massive and don't travel very far. So iodine-131 or cesium-137, both common things that are seen in reactors, they're much more energetic, but still most of their energy is absorbed. So iodine-131, if you're a physician or in medicine, you understand that that's one of the things that's used to actually destroy a person's thyroid gland. So somebody who has Graves' disease or some kind of thyroid disease and their gland's acting up and you don't want to surgically remove it, you want to just destroy it with iodine, you kind of give them some iodine-131. The main organ that takes up iodine is the thyroid, so it lodges in the thyroid, and as it decays, it destroys the tissue around it. And then I mentioned gamma, the second point on this slide, gamma energy, the other fraction of energy for the decay of plutonium. Less is absorbed. So, the problem here is that just a few molecules of a radioisotope may have a very small amount of energy, but all of the energy they produce, all of it, has the potential for great damage. And so, to a physicist, they may say, well, you only ingested a few particles of an isotope. The amount of physical energy we can calculate from that is very small and trivial compared with isotopes that are present naturally in the environment, or trivial compared with cosmic rays from outer space, trivial compared with diagnostic X-rays. But there's a lot of bang in the buck for those things. Next slide. And this is kind of the biology of it. Many of these isotopes produced as a consequence of nuclear fission, they deposit in the body because they're similar to other metals. So cesium looks like potassium, and it can fix in muscle and connective tissue. Iodine-131, I mentioned, is taken up and fixed by the thyroid as though it were regular iodine. Strontium gets taken up by bone. That's a big actor. Hold on. Okay. Strontium has a fairly significant half-life as well. And actually, I'm forgetting off the top of my head what strontium is as a half-life, but it's measured in many years. And next slide. So if you look at areas that have been studied where there's been a lot of exposure to these isotopes in the history of nuclear power on the surface of the Earth, sarcomas and thyroid tumors and osteosarcomas are among the common tumors associated with the exposure to radionuclides. So, the things we think of with leukemia and bone or blood element tumors, those are a little more common with massive or higher doses of radiation. But I've come to know people from Utah, and some of the stories you hear about the downwinders, that was the nickname given to the people from southern Utah who lived in the valleys that exposed to fallout from the above-ground nuclear tests in Nevada, 40s and 50s. And one woman who I know, her husband was one of 10 children. All of them died of sarcomas, all 10 children. He was the last to die. He died of an osteosarcoma, and he died just in the I think it was around 2000. It was about 10 years ago, 2001 or 2002. And so many years after his exposure, where he actually died of an osteosarcoma. And how do I know that osteosarcoma was due to exposure to radioactive fallout? I don't. You can never prove that. But the fact that all 9 of his other siblings died of the same disease and were exposed, it kind of raises your level of concern a little bit that this was actually a consequence of nuclear fallout. Now, go to the next slide. It isn't just these historical exposures. It isn't just Fukushima. I just mentioned this kind of anecdotally, and Lee may remember this too. I was at a conference with Lee Cowden, Dr. Cowden, in 2009, and I commented to him that in the electrodermal screening I was doing, I was just starting to use the Zyto at that point, but the screening I was doing on the Zyto, suddenly out of, I wasn't seeing a whole lot of isotopes show up when I did screening for heavy metals, doing electrodermal screening, but all of a sudden I was seeing a lot of uranium and plutonium and strontium and cesium, and I kind of asked him, what his take was on this, and he smiled, and he went over to his briefcase, and he pulled out a file where he'd been collecting articles about, just in the last few months, old satellites that were falling back to Earth, vaporizing in the atmosphere. All of them had nuclear reactors on board, and he'd noticed the same thing, and this was his explanation for that. So, this is just an ongoing problem with more and more radiation released from the existing nuclear reactors, existing contamination from Superfund sites that used to be sites that would process nuclear fuel and nuclear materials for nuclear weapons. Now we've got these accidents from Fukushima. It's the story you don't hear about. It's the elephant in the room that it just won't go away. And and it's really hard to know. I mean, you get a kind of spin in the press where it's nothing to worry about, it's a trivial problem, or it's the worst thing that's ever happened on the Earth. You hear stories that say that it's all under control, don't worry, and other stories that say it's not under control at all, that all of the damaged reactors have been breached, that the nuclear material is free of the containment vessels, that there's huge amounts of cesium still pouring into the oceans, and that will continue for decades, if not hundreds of years to come. So, I don't know. And so, that's next slide. So it's hard to get information. I mentioned the Department of Nuclear Engineering at University of California, Berkeley. The graduate students there decided on their own to just start. I mean, they had the equipment to do it. They just started doing monitoring of foods, grasses, soil, milk. And starting right after the meltdown at Fukushima, it was only weeks, not even weeks, just I think within the first week they started detecting iodine-131, cesium-134, cesium-137 in the environment blowing across from Japan. I would also mention that they've detected these elements across the Earth, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in India. Certainly in other parts of the United States, New England, Washington, D.C., Florida, Tennessee, Arkansas. Different groups have been looking. And go to the next slide. They've been monitoring milk, so I'll just use the data from milk. So if you look here, this is just looking at the record of what they found, iodine-131. So you see right in April, very high levels, and then it kind of drops off. Go to the next slide. Cesium-134 tended to drop off by October of 2011. Still measurable and worrisome, with a little bit of a spike in about March of 2012. Go to the next slide. And a little more cesium-137. That's a longer-lived half-life. Cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, and so just because of that, its persistence is going to. But this additional spike. Next slide. You can see that the amount of cesium-137 in February of 2012, it almost doubled from the levels of September of 2011. And in February 2012, almost a year after the meltdown at Fukushima, levels in milk are 150% of the EPA allowable levels for milk. The EPA, in its wisdom, has done what the Japanese have done. When these levels of what was allowable were created, there was actually a two-tier system. So there's the level of allowable radiation in foods at times when there's no emergency, and when there's an emergency, which was declared within weeks after Fukushima, then the allowable level is multiplied by 10. So the 150% of EPA allowable levels is allowable levels in times when there's no known releases going on. But right now it's under the allowable level for a time of emergency, which we're in. And so all this milk is still being sold. Next. Well, before we leave this slide, this cesium-137 slide, just notice the rather high amounts that were present for months, at least 4 months after Fukushima. There were mathematical models that tried to show how these radioisotopes were spread around the world, models that included climatic information about ocean currents, air currents, jet stream, but all of that information that used to be available, all that information was pulled. So none of those models are available or being run anymore. It's almost as though there's a desire to not look. And that's kind of predictable. That's what happened in the Soviet Union after Chernobyl. That's what happened in this country after 3 Mile Island. And so there's less monitoring now after Fukushima than there was before, because they started finding things, they quit looking.